Again, the way I'm grading now, if you put down, for this, if you put down a religion, wouldn't give you any points for that. But if you put down Egyptian, yeah, I'd give you at least 2 points for that. She was from Egypt. Pharaoh, excellent. I'd probably wind up giving all 3 points for that. Yes?
So, are you saying that majority of these questions are going to be open-ended?
No, none of them are open-ended. I mean, you know, like I said, hey, you can't just put down any old thing for an answer. Now, one of them, the question will be open-ended. Well, I don't know if you'll get that one or not, but for the rest of them, you can't just put down anything for an answer. You have to get something that's in the ballpark. And if I were to say, all right, here's one, upper I've already given you that it's Egypt. What is Upper Egypt?
Southern.
The Upper Egypt is the southern part of Egypt. And Lower Egypt was the northern part of Egypt. All right. Again, if you put Southern Egypt, I'd give you 3 points for that. All right. You know, that's the format the test will be in. Now, then the past consists of 10 questions that do with primary sources. Now, primary source, when the person saw the event. Secondary source, where a person read the primary sources and wrote about it, or read other sources, but he did not see the event. Yes? Oh, so another person asked that. For this first test, there will not be anything on it that resembles a date. And folks, I could spend hours talking about the dating in the ancient world, and it's a real problem. And even your book can give approximate dates. Well, later in the time period, we can give more accurate dates, but so many of the dates are approximate because these people, a lot of them deliberately distorted their history to make their kingdom look older than it actually was. And we're having to go through and try to unravel. And in a lot of cases, we dig up grave sites, and that tells us how long a pharaoh actually reigned or how long a king actually ruled. But to answer your question, there are no dates on this first. Now, later on, there will be a few, but on this one, none. Nothing. All right, any other questions? Okay. All right. I believe I ended last time. I was still in the. Wait, did I start the? And I ought to know this. Did I start on the Indo-European peoples, or was I still in Egypt when we left off last? Still in Egypt. All right. Yeah, I've been talking about the Book of the Dead of Pharaoh. In the case of Hatshepsut, she was just about the only queen who actually governed Egypt as the ruler. And when she passed on, her son tried to erase her memory by putting her statue in a garbage pit. But keep in mind, in the land of Egypt, garbage will last for generation and generation of dry desert sand. So her memory was somewhat kept alive, but he tried to act like she had never been the ruler and that he was his father's son and that he had succeeded directly from his father. Again, they tried to make their history look the way they wanted it to without necessarily being in tune with reality. In so much of Egyptian history was, well, it's one thing, it's a lot like Chinese history. Now, oh yes, something else I did not mention, but I think I'll mention it now in this connection. On the back of an American $1 bill, we don't use these much anymore. Most transactions are now done by debit card, credit card, or whatever, but on the back of a $1 bill is a picture of the Great Pyramid of Egypt. The Great Pyramid the top of it is detached. And on this detached top is an all-seeing eye. Suppose it covers the world. And there's some words there at the bottom that basically means New World Order. New Order of the world. I have to ask you folk, if any of you knows, what is an Egyptian monument doing on some very widely, well, at least once was some very widely circulated American currency? I mean, anybody have any idea? And I'll tell you, I don't blame you if you don't. Yes.
I don't really know, this is a weird guess, but I guess because Egypt was kind of like the ruling whatever of its time.
Yeah, not a bad guess. Yes.
Do with enlightenment ideas or something?
Say again loud.
Do with enlightenment ideas, maybe?
Enlightenment? Yeah, you're right. It had, I think, had a lot to do with the Enlightenment. The founding fathers were men of the Enlightenment, and they were trying to build a new world order from the United States. Now, folk, this is where it might get a little bit weird. Supposedly, the Great Pyramid was never finished and did not do what its builders intended. It was not a burial ground. I mean, I got something to remind you of, folks. There has never, ever been a body ever found inside any pyramid. And that's, I mean, this, someone always looking at me like, what are you talking about? Your book even says a burial ground, but then the bodies of the Egyptian pharaohs were found to the west in what's called the Valley of the Kings, far removed from the Nile in the west. And that's where all the bodies have been found, and all the mummies, not just the pharaohs, even the common people. The pyramid of Egypt, at least, were never intended to be burial grounds. And something else about pyramids, they are found all over the globe. Hundreds of them in Europe, in Asia, and of course Africa too. And if you go south of Africa, you find a bunch of them in Nubia. The biggest one is not the tallest one is the Pyramid of Giza near Cairo. The biggest one is actually the Pyramid of Copan that was built by the Mayans. It's not quite as tall. Now, the founding fathers were all men of the Enlightenment, and with no exceptions that I know of, they were all Masons. The word Mason means stone builder. Some of you have heard that before. Supposedly, they were going to finish the work that the United States is destined to finish the work that was started by the builders of the pyramid and that they could not quite finish. If that's far out, I'm sorry. The Great Pyramid might have been an attempt to, I feel like I'm getting on the limb pretty far, to finish the Tower of Babel, which the work was interrupted. An attempt to contact the anyway, if you read the story of the Tower of Babel, you may know what they were trying to do. Reach to another dimension, perhaps. Pyramid, same thing. The top, yes, detached and see everything, all-seeing eye. And this big CERN collider that's supposed to be really turned high up on September 24th. You can read it for yourself, folks. I gotta stop. So has anybody heard anything about what I'm talking about?
Yeah, you know.
Okay, a couple of you nodding your head. Yeah, what's that?
Watch Ancient Aliens.
Well, yeah, okay. And if you look at the right places on YouTube. All right. Got to say this about fairy tales. There are three beginnings to fairy tales. Fairy tales begin with once upon a time, or long ago and far away. Now here's a third one. This was told to me by a sergeant back when I was in the Army. And what follows is oftentimes a mixed with truth, but an exaggeration of sorts. Back when I was in the Army. Yeah, okay, right. And what that? Fairy tales also have a really high ending. And how do they end? And they live happily ever after. Yeah. Like I saw this man reading a book to his daughter. The book was titled Fairy Tales. And they lived happily ever after on Social Security. Very much a fairy tale. All right, leaving that. All right, anyway, Egypt. Why did they build the pyramids? I've dealt with that as much as I can. Folk, a lot of history is not what it seems or appears. And what they did, I mean, all right, when I was a youngster, a lot of my classmates, when I study history, it's irrelevant. What they did back there is becoming more and more and more relevant as time goes on. Before this class period's out, we'll be talking about Persia, otherwise known as Iran. You may know Persia is making big news big time, whether that's bad or good. Iraq, making big news big time. Egypt, making big news big time. I mean, you don't hear much about countries like Finland, Botswana, you know, where that, Singapore, not a lot anymore. But some of these other countries in the Middle East, the part we're studying about, making big news big time. And I mean, in our faculty meetings, we're sometimes reminded this college is not about we teachers, it's about you pupils. But I want to add to that, for history class, it's not just about you pupils, it's also about these people who lived 3,000 and 4,000 years ago and who are long gone. But what they did is likely to have very profound influence on us today. So their ideas and their works, their aspirations are far from dead. All right. Having said that, I know I talked about Osiris, Isis. I'm going to deal with this next when I come to the part about the Hebrews, which I will in a few minutes, about whether or not did the Israelis ever live in the land of Egypt, and if so, how much can we believe what the Bible says about their dwelling in Egypt. We'll get to that. As was the case of so many of these ancient empires, though Egypt was no exception, they rose, remained powerful for a while. Actually, Egypt had three periods. Then very early, they were strong and powerful. Then they declined. Then they became really strong and powerful again. Then they declined. Then they became strong and powerful again. Then they declined. This time, the last time they declined, they never rose again. Much of their history, they've been ruled by outsiders. They were conquered by Babylon, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Then they were conquered by Persia. Then partially conquered by Assyria. And finally conquered by Rome. Then they were part of the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire. Then finally they were conquered by the Arabs. So they have not been a powerful nation since very ancient times. But they have survived as a nation from ancient times until now. Now, I do want to mention one of their pharaohs named Akhenaten, A-K-H-A-N-A-T-E-N. He is believed to have tried to change the religion of Egypt from polytheism to monotheism. And as is the case of so many people who try to make such a profound change, as soon as he was gone, the next Pharaoh undid everything that he did. Now, you'll be seeing this throughout history. And in our own country, I look for another president to come along and try to undo a lot that our present president has done. This is just standard history, folk. Just simply the way life is. This is part of the history of the popes. Typically, a pope will come along in front of his first acts is to undo what the previous popes worked so hard to get done. Then he'll start on his own program, and as soon as he's gone, the next pope will work to undo what he did. I mean, it's just simply a fact of life. But Akhenaten tried to change the religion of Egypt, but to no avail. All right. I'll move on then from Egypt. Indo-Europeans. Now, on page 25, and I just had one of your classmates ask me, do we need to bring our book to class? I mean, I think so. And if you would not notice, I'm teaching from the book, and I'll often make reference to maps that are in the book. But anyway, on page 25, you'll find a map of the Indo-Europeans. The Indo-Europeans are believed to have started out up here in what we know of as the Caucasus Mountains, from which comes the word Caucasian. And from the Caucasian Mountains, which are located somewhat between the Black and Caspian Seas, very close to the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. Actually, your book seems to think they're closer to the Black Sea than the Caspian Sea. Be that as it may, Indo-Europeans spread out. One group went north, another group went into what is today Greece and became the Greeks. Some of the Greeks broke off from the other Greeks and went into Germany and became the Germans. Others went into Italy and became the Romans. And then some went to the British Isles and they became the Britons. And some went into Persia, and from Persia on into India. These were the Medes and Persians, and then the ones that went into India, we'll talk about in the next chapter, they were the Aryans. That word Aryan you'll be familiar with if you've studied Adolf Hitler. He was fascinated with the Aryans for the wrong reasons, but we'll cover that in the next chapter. But yeah, the Medes and Persians we'll talk about today. Now, the Indo-Europeans, all right, and again, folks, it depends on your worldview. Supposedly, after the flood, Noah had 3 sons, one of them named Shem, another one named Japheth, another one named Ham. The Shemites are called the Semitic peoples. Your Semitic peoples are your Assyrians, Babylonians, I'm not going to write this down, Elamites, and also especially the Jews. Now, when you hear the term anti-Semite, and anti-Semitism has reared its ugly head from time to time throughout history, what, and I'm surprised how many college students don't know, what does anti-Semite mean? Yes?
As having a prejudice towards Jewish people.
Prejudice against Jewish people. Strong prejudiced Jews, anti-Semite. Adolf Hitler was anti-Semite. Again, the Jews are not the only Semites. Now, if the old legends are true, Japheth went north after the flood, and probably his descendants settled around here, and then they began to scatter out. What made them move, and if you look on a map, much of their movement was south. What might have made them move was a climate change, but we don't know that for sure. But some of them moved. Now, these Indo-European peoples were like these peoples in this part of the world, and here in one way, they built a lot of monuments from stone. Your book calls them megaliths. I have a book at home that enumerates 10,000 European stone structures. They leave out the Stonehenge. There's too much written about the Stonehenge already and too much known, but they named 10,000, of which we have no idea who built them. It's just that they've always been there where they are. The very earliest records describe them as already being ruins. 10,000 or so stone structures, and some of them have stones that are pretty heavy. Now, in the case of the Stonehenge, we have no idea how those big stones were moved from wherever they were quarried to where they are now. Now, some people will say that the Stonehenge stones were quarried in Ireland and moved to England from Ireland. There's a problem with that, folks. No wooden ship that we've ever seen could carry even one of them. Now, that doesn't mean they weren't quarried in Ireland. The issue is how were they moved from Ireland to England? Or even if they were quarried in England, it becomes a real task to figure out how were those stones moved from anywhere else to where they're sitting now. Again, as in the case of the Great Pyramid, folks, we simply don't know the answer. The Stonehenge was obviously an astronomical object, among other things, and it appears that at one point the stones were in fact moved maybe 2 or 3 times to line them up in such a way that on Midsummer Day, one of the stones would form a perfect circle right in the center of the place, in the center of the Stonehenge. Midsummer Day being June 21st. Now, why was it necessary to move the stones? Did the earth shift on its axis? Did the island of England, the British Isles, shift a little bit? Or was there some kind of other astronomical phenomenon that occurred that caused the shift? Again, we can only at this point guess because we don't know when the stones were moved. If we knew that, we might know why. But the idea was apparently to get these stones lined in such a way that at certain times of the year, the stones would point at certain other stones or point right in the center of the circle and make a perfect circle there in the center, which can only happen one day of the year, that day being, again, June 21st. We know of as summer solstice. The one day of the year when the sun goes as far north as it's going to get before it starts its long journey back south again. Some of you might know what I'm talking about, the rest of you really should. All right. Now, of the Indo-European peoples, one of the peoples who developed the biggest empire, at least at first. Now later, of course, the Greeks and Romans were developed bigger, but the group was the Hittites. The Hittites took over this region here of today, modern Turkey. And at one point, they became so powerful that they went down to the city of Babylon and sacked Babylon, because they didn't conquer Babylon. They just simply went inside the city, and the men went with their, to sack means you go with your big bags and take everything of value you want and go out of the city with it. Again, this was very destructive to Babylon, and it took the city of Babylon 1,000 years to recover. This was shortly after the time of Hammurabi and the time of Hammurabi's grandson. Again, another example of a great empire that had a sudden hard fall. I forgot to say that I've had two pupils, one of them well, this time last year, and another one in the spring, and they both sat in this classroom, and they both told me that the United States cannot fall. Yeah. There is no such thing as a nation that cannot fall. There's no such thing as a civilization that's so mighty. And one of them used an argument that we got to learn what constitutes nor what doesn't. That because the United States is a democracy, and I've got the word for you, democracies have the worst track record of any other type of government in history as far as having a knack for crumbling. We'll talk more about that when we come to Greece. When we come to Rome, Greece had several democracies, they all crumbled. Rome started out as a republic, a type of democracy, it crumbled. And during my lifetime, Latin American democracies, which that Far Eastern Asian democracies spring up all the time. They will copy the United States, and in short order, a dictatorship will take over. This has happened many, many a time. Latin America finally settled down, and you hardly hear of a strong man taking over a Latin American country anymore. But so they settled down to something like a democracy. But for a while, it was just wake up in the morning and some military dictator is taking over the country. Wake up the next morning, some military dictator is taking over another country overnight. You know. Anyway, leaving that, Babylon fell for the second time. Babylon was to fall again. And the Hittites, as is the case of so many people, including the Sumerians and the Harappans, they just simply vanished from history. And when I say they vanished from history, all right, folks, critics of the Bible used to say the Bible was wrong because it mentioned a group of people called the Hittites. And we know there were no Hittites. Then we discovered not only were there Hittites, but actually they were very strong and powerful people who lived in this region, and their influence was felt down here in the land of Canaan, or what is today Israel. They actually did exist, and they were very, very strong. So again, you have to be careful when you say something did not exist. But say if anything did not exist or doesn't exist, you have to be able to look over the whole world at one time. And that's tricky, to say the least. Anyway, the Hittites. All right. Now, the next group of people we'll talk about, now the Phoenicians. With the Phoenicians, we come back to Semitic people. Now, I say that tongue-in-cheek. Your book says the Phoenicians spoke a Semitic language, but they might not have actually been Semitic. Again, it might be that as when they were in their younger, before they were fully formed as a nation, they might have lived among Semitic people before they established their own identity. Some people think they actually were Hamitic, from Ham. But anyway, the Phoenicians lived on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, in what is today Lebanon, near this, what is today, well actually, they actually lived in what is today, near Beirut. In this region right here, they had two big contributions. Number one was they fanned out. They were seagoers. They fanned out and sailed the Mediterranean, and they founded the city of Carthage, which we'll talk about when we come to chapter 4. Keep in mind now, they also visited the Greeks, and they taught the Greeks the alphabet, which I'm going to elaborate on in a few minutes. Greece. Now, where else did they visit? Now, folk, there have been scholars who are not part of the mainstream who will say that they can find Phoenician artifacts in Minnesota, Nova Scotia, South America, the Amazon, the Philippines, Indonesia, South Africa, all over the globe, that these people seem to be finding Phoenician artifacts or evidence. We do not know if the Phoenicians actually left the Mediterranean world or not. But there have been persons who have said that they can find Phoenician artifacts, again, wherever, all over the world. But now, their big contribution to Western civilization from the word Phoenicia comes the word phonics. They gave us our alphabet that we use today. Every nation in Europe is now using their phonetic alphabet. Now, the Greek alphabet, as I said earlier, the Phoenicians taught the Greeks to write. The Greek letters are a little bit different from letters that you'll find in among the Latins. And again, on page 26, your book shows a comparison with how the Phoenicians wrote to letter A, how the Greeks wrote it, the early Greeks wrote it, how later Greeks wrote it, how the Greeks pronounced it, how the early Latins wrote it, how the classical Latins wrote it, so on and so forth. And they set up an alphabetical order that we still use with the words like alpha, beta, gamma, delta. That's the Greek names, with epsilon, and so on and so forth. The Phoenicians called them Aleph, Beth, Gimel, Daleth. So, a lot of your Phoenician letters do not quite resemble modern letters. Well, the letter epsilon is turned around from our letter E. It's the letter E. And the letter, same thing for F. It's like our letter F, but turned around. But you can recognize it with just a little bit of training. Now, again, this is a big contribution because before the invention of the Phoenician alphabet, mankind seemed to have written every word had its own symbol, and you had to learn thousands upon thousands of symbols to be able to read. With a Phoenician alphabet, you can start teaching children to read as young as 6 years old. Before that, that was very difficult to do when you had thousands of symbols to learn, and a 6-year-old just simply could not differentiate between one word and another. Later, your minds would mature more to where you could. But again, big contribution to humanity and made writing a whole lot simpler, made reading a whole lot easier. The alphabet that the Latins took over, then it found its way into the English language, and like I say, every European country, as far as I know, is using something that derived from the Phoenician alphabet, not the actual Phoenician alphabet, but something that derived. The letters change a little bit from time to time down through the generations. All right. Oh yeah, on page 20, I skipped, well, I did mention Nubia a little bit, but I'm going to have more to say about Nubia when we come to the chapter on Africa. Which brings me up to the Hebrews. Before I get to that point, it is important. Yes?
Just two quick questions. You said the two contributions of the Phoenicians, one is phonics and then what's
They
the
simply, the one is the phonics, and the other is that they went all over the known world with their ships. And they founded the city of Carthage, taught the Greeks how to write in a new script. The Greeks actually had writing before that time, but they taught the Greeks to write in a new way. But they traveled. And their trading, I mean, again, you have to know how important trade is, because we can't have a modern world without trade. I mean, even something, folk, that looks as simple as this, probably the components that made it up, there's only two of them. One of them might have come from one side of the globe and another would come from the other. I mean, there's no place on earth that has everything you need to put together something like a television, an automobile, or a computer. You have to. This part of the world has this, and that part of the world has that, so there has to be trade and commerce going on in order for us to have anything like the modern world. So trade is really important. The Phoenicians were traders. Yes.
And then the Hittites were the biggest empire of what time?
The biggest empire up to that time. Now, the biggest one that we'll talk about in chapter 1 is the Persian Empire. They became quite large. The Hittite Empire, it got to be fairly large, but actually, I believe it was larger at one point than the Egyptian, but that's debatable. But the biggest one in chapter 1 is the Persian Empire. Now, as to what is the biggest empire ever, probably Genghis Khan's in the 1100s. Again, but if he actually had all the territory he claimed to have, he claimed he had all of Siberia. We don't know if he actually could enforce his law or collect taxes from that vast, dry, cold region of Siberia or not. But he claimed it was his anyway. All right, Israel. Well, are there any other questions, first of all? Okay. I could easily spend, folk, the entire semester talking about the history of Israel, but we're going to cover it only in just a few minutes. Now, again, as is the case of some of these countries, Israel does exist today, but for nearly 1900 years, they did not. Israel eventually inhabited the land to the south of the Egyptians, but according to their own history, they were descended from nomadic herdsmen. Nomadic herdsmen, 3 of them, named Abraham, who started out here and then went up to here and then went down to the land of what they called at that time the land of Canaan. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, who became known later as Israel. There are questions, again, as to whether or not Abraham even existed. I will say this. I mean, somebody who says Abraham did not exist, every one of you in here, including me, had to have had some ancestor who lived around the year 1800 BCE. If we didn't, we're not here. So yes, did Israel have an ancestor who lived around 1800 BC? Well, if they didn't, then they don't exist. It's that simple. Just follow my logic, folk. All of us are descended from people who lived at that time period, or we didn't, and we're not here. It's that simple. But anyways, I read recently that Abraham never existed, and the person gave his reasons. Be that as it may, we're going to later talk about Zoroaster, who also they're now saying possibly did not exist. All right. Yes?
Just real quick, when you say that anybody who says that he didn't exist, anybody who we're all...
We had to have had an ancestor living at that time.
Why at that specific time?
Why so? If we didn't have an ancestor living at that time, I mean, then we're not here. I mean, you follow the logic.
Yeah, that's true.
Your
But there
logic
were
flows.
people before that. That's
Oh, there were people before that. There have been people since.
Yeah.
But you had to have somebody who's our ancestor. I mean, now again, if you study your genealogy, I mean, you have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents. It goes 1630. Eventually the lines come together. Basically, being of European descent, I am probably descended from every European who was alive in the year 1000, because I'd have about 2 million ancestors at that point. Some of them would be the same. And the same thing goes if you're from Africa. You probably are descended from every African who lived 1,000 years ago who had any children. So on and so forth. But anyway, after Abraham and Isaac died, when Jacob was really old, a famine occurred in the world. And again, folk, I have read some reasons why that famine might have occurred. It might have had a whole lot to do with a big war. But anyway, a big famine occurred. And to make a long story short, supposedly all the 70 people who were descended from Israel went to Egypt. Israel and his 12 sons and all their wives and all his grandsons and maybe a few great-grandsons. 70 of them altogether went to Egypt. And they lived in a land called Goshen. Now, if you know anything about the Egyptian mentality, you have the Nile River flowing up. I mean, this is their vision of the Nile. And actually, it does not quite this straight. This is their vision of the Nile. Then when the Nile started to empty into the Mediterranean, it just seemed to go every which way, chaos. And every year there was a flood. And when the flood was over, of course, this region would change shape. Where the Egyptians, they couldn't tolerate this. So they tended to not want to live in this land of Goshen, which they looked on as being a wasteland, a land of where the shape of it changed. And they said, it's not part of Egypt. So Pharaoh allowed them to live here in the Nile Delta region. They lived there for some 400 years, according to their own accounts. And then they left. Now, according to the story, they left as a result of a man named Moses. All right. Again, folks, I think I mentioned there were 3 ancient people who as babies were thrown into the water to get rid of. I mentioned Sargon of Agad. Did I mention him in this class? Sargon. Okay, well, Sargon was floated down the river where some shepherds found him, and they brought him up, and eventually found his way into the palace of the king of Uruk, and eventually he grew up to build a very mighty, mighty empire. I should have mentioned him, so I'm mentioning him now. Sargon. The first known empire builder in history. Then after Sargon, the next one was Moses. And the next one we'll mention before the class is over with, if I get around to it, is Cyrus. All 3 of these men were floated down a river to get rid of. In all 3 cases were found. In the case of Moses, though, he wasn't found by shepherds. He was found by the princess of Egypt, Pharaoh's daughter. So he was brought up in the Egyptian palace, schooled in all the learning and wisdom of the Egyptians. So that's where he learned how to read and write. Then he committed some sacrilege. It's not a sacrilege. He committed a crime against Egypt, and for 40 years roamed down here in the Arabian desert, tending his father-in-law's sheep, and then went back to Egypt and freed the slaves. Now, 150, 200 years ago in our own country's history, the slave's favorite Bible character was Moses. And it's not hard to understand why. And one of the heroes of American blacks is a woman named Grandma Moses. Grandma Moses would just appear at night in a camp, when a campfire burning, and say, all right, come with me. If anybody said, oh, I don't want to go, she'd whip out a revolver, you're coming with me. And everybody came whether they wanted to or not. And the slaves that she had helped escape was put in the Underground Railroad, and most of them were never found again by their masters. And Grandma Moses was never caught. I mean, all this is American history. But anyway, it comes from the same name, Free the Slaves. Now, the stories about the slaves being freed may sound fantastic. And you would probably read, if you do any research, that we cannot find these stories in the Egyptian records. Well, 2 things I want to point out. Number 1, these ancient peoples, except for the Hebrews, tended to only write about their victories and their high points and leave off the low points of their kingdom. And the other thing is, you really do find them in Egyptian records if you simply go back 200 years from the standard. If you believe the biblical account and then match up the Egyptian account with the biblical account, you can find a record where the people are complaining of plagues of flies and boils and gnats, letters that they wrote to each other that simply seem to jive pretty well with the plagues. And also about this time in Egyptian history, a new group of people called the Hyksos came out of the desert. They just came in and they took over Egypt, apparently without a fight. But how could they take over a country like Egypt without a fight? Here's a reason, folk. Pharaoh's army was all drowned in the Red Sea. The Egyptians had no army anymore. The Hyksos took over, and they ruled Egypt for a few generations, several generations, before eventually the Egyptians were able to throw them out. But they were called shepherd kings, and shepherds the Egyptians loathed shepherds. That's another reason why the Egyptians wanted the Israelis to live up here in the land of Goshen, but don't live among us. We can't tolerate sheep in our country of cattle, and if you know anything about sheep and cattle, you can't graze them together. The sheep graze so close to the ground that cattle cannot eat. Neither can horses. They cannot eat where sheep have been. So the cattle will starve to death if they're allowed to graze with the sheep. But whatever the reason, the Egyptians hated shepherds, and then all of a sudden these shepherds came in and took over and ruled them. And again, apparently without a struggle. Also, I mentioned how the Egyptian history, you have your intermediate periods. You have your periods of prosperity, followed by an intermediate period. There were two intermediate periods. I mean, you have the Old Kingdom, first intermediate period. Middle Kingdom, second intermediate period. It's believed that by some that the leaving from Egypt by the Hebrew slaves occurred at the end of the Middle Kingdom, just before, and it started the second intermediate period. There was a period of chaos and a period of turmoil. Now, according to the account, the Israelis then went to the Red Sea and crossed the Red Sea. Now, I want to pause here. I mean, I may have told you this already, but I'll repeat it. When I was in high school, I sat in a class with the captain of a football team, who later on became a college teacher also, but he's full-time, not like me. But he said, oh, about that story of the Exodus, and I don't believe that, and I'm a preacher's kid. Well, I'm also a preacher's kid. I didn't say anything. I let it go. And the teacher tried to explain and gloss over how that there were certain places in the Red Sea where a tide might have occurred and would have raised the level of the land enough to where an army, to where the Israelis could come up. Then the tide would have gone down, and that would have closed in on the Egyptian army. But here's the case. Here's the point I want to make, folks. The Hebrews kept their history different from the Egyptians. When the Egyptians wrote history, it was something that was only read by the scholars, the priests, the very high educated, and they told the people what they wanted them to hear. In contrast, the Hebrews wrote their history down and told it to everybody. If the story of the Exodus is a fabrication, basically 2.5 million Jews had to get together and say, let's lie to our descendants. And 2.5 million Jews had to have lied to their descendants. Now, the way the Jews keep this story alive, and some of you, if you are Jewish, you might know even more about this than I do, was every Passover, they will gather and assemble, and they'll look around the room and decide, now, who's the youngest person here? And the youngest person, it's got to be someone who's at least old enough to talk. But the youngest person might be a preschool child, but never old enough to talk. I mean, someone who's too young to talk won't be able to participate. Then they'll ask, now, who's the oldest person here? And again, it's someone who's very old oftentimes, but still has their mind about them, not someone who has lost their mind due to Alzheimer's, senility, or whatever else. But they ask, so this young child will go up to this old person who might even be sitting in a wheelchair and ask, why are we celebrating tonight different from other nights? And then the old person is supposed to tell the story. And they have been repeating this ceremony for 3,000 years. And even the agnostics and atheists among the Jews believe it. I mean, I've read books by Emanuel Velikovsky, who is an agnostic Jew, and Zachariah Sitchin, who was not much better as far as belief. They believed it. The Jews, it's like ingrained in them, written in their mentality, they believe it fairly strongly that at one time they were in fact slaves in Egypt. And you can find the records if you give Egyptian history a slight 200-year twist, which is quite legal to do in my way of thinking. Anyway, according to their account, they found their way into the land of Canaan, and they partially conquered the land of Canaan, did not completely conquer it. Their lawgiver was Moses. Suppose Moses received a law, and which I'll go into in a few minutes. Anyway, once in the land of Canaan, they at first were ruled by people who seemed to have more ability than anyone else. They were ruled by judges. When a judge died, the next judge would take over. When that judge died, the next judge would take over, and so on and so forth. Then finally they set up a king. The two most famous kings were David and Solomon. David is remembered for this famous story about him killing the giant Goliath. And folk, I have to reiterate, every ancient people believed that the ancient world had giants. Goliath was 6 cubits tall. According to count, that would be 9 feet. In other words, up about as high as that line right there, the second block down, right about there. That'd be about how tall he was. And according to count, David had a sling and slung at the giant's forehead, and then used the giant's own sword to chop his head off. Solomon was the richest king that Israel ever had, and one of the richest kings who ever lived. But Solomon had one problem. With his wealth, he overburdened his people. The people demanded of his son, give us lighten the load, lighten our taxes, lighten the work we require us to do. The son refused, so the kingdom split. The northern kingdom was called Israel, the southern kingdom Judah. Well, time went on. Eventually, after 300 years, the northern kingdom of Israel was carried captive by Assyria. Assyria was never able to conquer Judah. According to the account, the Assyrian army did camp outside of Jerusalem. According to Herodotus, rats ate the bowstrings and forced the king of Assyria to return home. According to most scholars, though a plague struck the Assyrian camp, according to biblical account, an angel came down and smote most of the army of the Assyrians, and when he woke up, most of them were all dead. So anyway, the Assyrian army had to leave Judah. But 100 years later, Judah was conquered by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar made news in recent times because Saddam Hussein was a fan of Nebuchadnezzar's, and Saddam Hussein claimed he was descended from Nebuchadnezzar. Anyway, Babylon conquered Judah, and the way they conquered him, it wasn't just they conquered and put him to tribute. Both Assyria and Babylon had a habit of taking the upper classes of people and deporting them to far distant lands. You might say, what would this do? Because only the upper class in those days were educated, and only the upper classes had any ability to lead, at least supposedly. People would only follow someone who was from upper class. So the Assyrians came in and they took the upper classes and left the poor people behind. The Babylonians did the same thing. They took the upper classes of people and left the poorer people behind to tend the land and keep the wild beasts from multiplying against them. The kingdom of Israel has never really been found. We don't know what happened to them for sure. There's all kinds of theories. To me, the best theory I've ever read is that they found a way to the Volga River, right up in here. Yeah, Volga River. Yeah, right here. They were taken, up here, so far away they never found their way back, and their descendants are still living along the Volga River. Yes, there are several Jewish communities right along here. And to me, this is the best theory I've heard as to what happened to them, but that's not necessarily 100%, may not be 100% right. As for Judah, they were allowed to return under a Persian leader named Cyrus. Cyrus, as soon as he took over, one of the first things he did was allow all the conquered peoples to return to their homeland, but Cyrus's influence did not extend up here. But he allowed all the conquered peoples to return, including the Jews. The Jews rebuilt their nation, and they were in existence at the time still in existence at the time of Christ, and they were still around when Christianity got started. Then the Romans had to defeat them 3 times. And no, I'm not going to ask these dates, but they did one of the days, 63 BCE, the Romans defeated them again in AD 70, or CE 70 to be correct. Then defeated for the last time in CE 135, but in CE 135, the Romans told them, all you Jews, move out, get out of here, and stay out. And for 1900 years, the Jews were to roam much of the world. And in 1948, a few of them returned and refounded the nation of Israel. Something that's fairly unique in modern times. All right. Your book asks the question, was there a united kingdom of Israel? And folks, I say this, every history book I have ever seen, when you come to the study of Israel, they have to take some poke at the biblical account to try to say that the biblical account is wrong in this area, is wrong in that. But every one of them takes a different poke at a different account. Again, they were poking at one point saying that Moses could not have written because writing had not been invented at that time. Now they know that writing was in use 1,000 years before Moses. At one time, like I mentioned, they said the Hittites did not exist. Now your book is saying that was Israel ever really completely united? Again, I think so, but scholars are somewhat disunited on that question. There's even some question as to whether or not Moses even existed, just like there's a question about some other ancient peoples. All right, now, Israel's big contribution, and I can see where I'm somewhat running out of time. Israel's big contribution to humanity was their religion. Their religion was monotheistic as opposed to polytheistic. I know I've mentioned these words before. They believed that there was only one God. All right, now, folks, what I'm about to do, I might be putting myself on a limb again, but here is my observations about what is the practical difference between monotheism and polytheism. Simply this. Only monotheistic people are generally scientific and capable of scientific achievement and advancement. Polytheistic people are not. You might say, how come? If you believe that nature is God, then you believe that nature has a mind of its own. Therefore, if nature has a mind of its own, it will not obey laws necessarily, and therefore it will do what it chooses. Now, well, right here. This is an older laptop. My newer one is in this repair shop right now. This thing has more than 1 million transistors inside it that work together, and some, not to mention resistors and capacitors by the millions, that work together in some kind of harmony and unity. And if you believe in regularity, you can believe that you can put together another device like this one, and the other device will perform the same way this one does. You might say, what's the big deal? The ancients did not realize this. If the river is God, if the ground beneath your feet is God, if the trees are all God, why, hey, how do you get your car started? Well, before you start your car, perform some kind of sacrifice to the spirit of the God that resides in that car. And if you all come out of the class this afternoon and go to your cars and your car doesn't start, you start performing some kind of a religious ritual to get your car going, you might be put in some kind of an insane asylum. But this was the way the mind of the ancient man operated. Now, we believe that if your car doesn't start because it has had some kind of mechanical defect, when you solve the mechanical problem, it will run again. Yes, it will. Because the car is not God, and the car does not have a mind of its own. Nature is not God, and nature doesn't have a mind of its own. Therefore, nature has a regularity and an order about it that polytheistic people don't see. Now, keep in mind, too, I'm talking about something that you might be this much familiar with, the cakes you put in the oven. Today, Hostess, Twinkies that came back in business, they can make the same cake, thousands upon thousands. They always taste the exact same way. They put the same ingredients. Well, the ancients didn't have this ability. Why? Their ovens were not accurate enough. So they would put a cake in an oven and like, I hope this turns out okay. Maybe some of us do this, but hey, the cake will turn, if you put the right ingredients, mixed the right way, and put it in the right temperature of an oven for the right amount of time, it will turn out to be like the other cake that was made the same way. Again, the ancients didn't have this ability, so all they could do when they put bread in the ovens or cakes in their ovens was just hope for the best. Today we have more control. We know what the oven temperature is. And again, we believe that there's a regularity and order to the universe that the ancients, polytheistic people did not have. And we can owe a lot of that to the Hebrews, who I really don't think they gave us monotheism, but who somewhat turned the world back to monotheism after a lot of the world had left monotheism, thanks to the wicked Inanna, whom I talked about last class. All right. Israel's religion also was concerned with morality, something that you don't find in the ancient world until you come to the Persians. There was no moral standard among the pagans, but Israel's religion had the belief system that we don't believe in this because God said it. In other words, we should not steal because God said we should not because of, it's just against our moral code. They again attached morality to religion, something that you don't find in much of the ancient world. All right. Late in their history, Israel was visited by prophets. Your book mentioned them, I can't help but mention. The prophets said, hey, be careful. These old kingdoms of Assyria that died out and Babylon that died out, they're going to make a comeback. Be careful. And when they come back, you aren't ready for them. You need to get yourselves ready. And also said you need to stay true to your God because only your God can deliver you. The message of the prophets largely went unheeded, with the result that Assyria and Babylon wound up conquering them. All right, which brings us to the next point, Assyria. The Assyrians claimed to be descended from Shem's son Ashur. And again, you have Shem, son of Noah. He had a son named Ashur. The Assyrians were polytheistic. They wound up, though, saying that Ashur was the god who made the heaven and the earth. In other words, basically, they were ancestor worshippers. The same way, hey, the Greeks were to some extent. Japheth is believed to be Jupiter. If you can see the similarity, or Iapetus is sometimes associated with Japheth. The Chinese were also ancestor worshippers, and some people even suspect that deep down the Egyptians might have been. The Egyptian pharaohs certainly were. Anyway, the Assyrians were users of iron, and folk, if I forgot to mention, the Hittites are credited with being the first users of iron. And notice as man progressed, now this is standard view, not mine, but from the Old Stone Age to the Middle Stone Age, the Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic, then from there to the Bronze Age, and from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. The Hittites were the people who taught the world the use of iron. Iron is a difficult metal to work with. In it, no matter how hot you can get a fire, you cannot melt iron until you start blowing oxygen in. And again, if you've seen it done, of course, today we have machines. The old days, they would use big, super big billows that would blow in a lot of air on the flame. You had to get the flame pretty hot already. Then if you blew oxygen on it, it would get the flame hot enough to melt the iron. The iron was melted in a clay pot. And that's because clay has such a high melting temperature, it will not melt even when the iron turns liquid. Then once the iron was melted, they could remove the impurities. The iron would sink to the bottom, the liquid iron would sink to the bottom, and the impurities would float to the top because they were usually lighter. Then they would get someone with a clay puddle, called a puddler, and he would clear away the impurities off of the top of the iron, and what would be left afterward was pure iron. They would pour this iron into a mold, or they would leave it as it is, and blacksmiths would work the iron, change the iron into shapes of swords, chariot wheels, spearheads, or armor, shields, whatever they chose, plows, whatever they chose to use it for. The Assyrians also were great users of iron. The Hittites, the Assyrian Empire, consists of this region right here. It was a crossroads between people traveling from north to south, and a crossroads between traveling from east to west. So the Assyrians were invaded often, and they learned quickly the meaning of fear. And therefore, they are remembered, among other things, for their cruelty, extreme, harsh cruelty. The idea was to treat their conquered people so badly that they would not want to conquer again. I won't go into details of just how they tortured their people, but it was, to say the least, very gruesome. The Assyrians fought a war against Axum down here. This is the land of Axum, south of Egypt. And I'll have more to say about that when we come to the chapter on Africa, chapter 8, I believe. But they went through Israel and went through Egypt to fight this war against Axum. They fought several wars, one after another. They had to. Inevitably, they got very powerful. Actually, they were powerful around 1800 BCE. Then they fell out of power for about 1,000 years. Then in the 600s, they became, actually the 800s, they became powerful again. And they rose to great heights, and their decline was rather abrupt and sudden. One of the things they did have, though, was they had a library, which we have found, and the library consists of stone and clay tablets, which we are able to read and can reconstruct a lot of their history. So there have been persons who have devoted their entire lives to studying Assyrian history. They are called Assyriologists. And there's a lot to say about them. All right, having said that, folk, I have a strong fascination for the Assyrians myself. And what I'm about to say is something I've never said before, except I finally said it this morning's class. The ancient prophets said that Assyria was going to become very powerful again at the end time. I did talk to a man recently who made a link that I cannot yet make, who said that ISIS is the ancient Assyrians coming back. It is known that there are 10 million Assyrians in the world. Now, some of the older history books say the Assyrians disappeared from history. But now that we know more about them, we know that there are some 10 million people, 5 million of them still living here, 5 million others scattered all over the earth. But they claim that they are descended from the Assyrians, and that ISIS might be indeed the remnants of the Assyrian Empire that's about to come together again and become very, very powerful in this part of the world. Again, you can take that for what it's worth. The Assyrians had 5 capitals, one of them Nimrod, Nineveh, Khorsabad. Ashurbanipal was one of the last of the great Assyrian kings. Don't worry about the name, but your book does show a picture of him killing a lion. And it looks like one of his horses, Ashurbanipal, was about to get the worst of it, with the lion attacking the rear end of that horse. But Ashurbanipal has his spear in the mouth of another lion. In the end, these people really apparently like to hunt. And all right. So much for the Assyrians for now. Which takes us up to the Medo-Persian Empire. I call it the Medo-Persian because at first it was the Empire of the Medes, then it became the Persian Empire. The Medes and Persians were 2 groups of people who got along. At first the Medes were more powerful and they were the rulers, but then the Persians became the more powerful and they became the rulers. With Persia, we're talking about the nation, modern nation of Iran. These people were Indo-European, as I've already mentioned. They were not Semitic, like Babylon and Assyria and Israel, but they were from this region of Europe, the Caucasus region, and came down, and some of them went on farther and settled here in parts of India. They were the Aryans, but we'll talk about them in chapter 2. Anyway, Medo-Persia. They were the biggest empire of the ancient world that we'll talk about, and your book does show a map of them, and the map is on page 31. Their empire almost stretched from in size, almost as big as the United States, but didn't quite cover as much land, but it was quite large. Anyway, they ruled their empire by means of a postal system. In other words, where they would keep the mail moving constantly. In other words, if the king sent a letter throughout the kingdom, he could expect within a week this letter would reach the entire kingdom. He put post offices at various strategic locations, and sometimes when a postman would come to a certain post office, he would find a horse already saddled. He would simply dismount his horse and leave it for the postman to take care of and get on another horse with his mail, of course, with his mail, and carry it to the next post. But sometimes the mailman and the horse stopped, and a new mailman took over, and the new man would keep on going, and they would gallop day and night, never stopping. I mean, well, each individual mailman would stop for the night, and each individual horse would stop after a few hours. But they would gallop for the mail. The mail would go from one end of the empire to the other in less than a week's time. It reminds us somewhat of our Pony Express that we had in our country in 1859. That only lasted about a year. Then the train took over, and the telegraph even took over, and the Pony Express became obsolete. But they had horsemen that could keep the mail moving. The mail, in other words, once the mail was sent, it never stopped. Riders would change, horses would change, but the mail would not stop. Now, the great ruler of the Persians, I mean, they had several, but the great ruler was Cyrus, whom I've already mentioned. He's remembered as being, unlike the Assyrians, he was supposedly a very kind man. One of his first acts as king was to issue a decree that all conquered peoples who wished to could return to their homelands. And a bunch of Jews who had been deported by Nebuchadnezzar then rose up and returned back. And if the kingdom of Israel was carried all the way up to here, this was outside of Cyrus's domain. So maybe that's why that Cyrus' domain did not affect these people. But a lot of people living in Judea, that's where the word Jew comes from, the word Judah. A lot of these people then returned to their homeland. Cyrus, as I mentioned earlier, was floated down a river, and here's why. His grandfather was the king. His grandfather was a Mede. But this Median king had no sons, but only daughters. One of his daughters married a Persian, and this Persian man had a baby that he called Cyrus. In those days, you became what your father was. Now, I understand among the Jews today, you don't become a Jew unless your mother was one. But in those days, you became what your... So the prophecy got out that this king is going to raise up the Persians, and Persia is going to become more powerful than Medes. So the grandfather took the baby Cyrus and put him in a river and floated him down a river, where some shepherds found him. These shepherds, in tracing back his identity, eventually realized that, hey, this is the lost prince of Persia. So these shepherds then eventually worked to send Cyrus back to the palace. Cyrus overthrew his grandfather, but he was such a generous man, he allowed his grandfather to live, at least according to one account. According to another account, he made him governor of a distant province and sent him far away. But in no account did he kill his grandfather like people would normally do when they overthrew the king. Again, he was quite generous, quite benevolent, and as to why, that is a subject for next time. I have to close. I'll see you on Wednesday, folks.